The tanks are doing well, but there have been a lot of changes in the last 18 months, so let's get started. These systems have been running for over 5 years using a heavy nutrient in and heavy nutrient out approach. But about a year and a half ago, signs that that method was no longer cutting it started to show. It wasn't a major issue, but I could tell that some colonies weren't growing as fast as they used to, and some were getting too light. The first thing I tried to do was feed the fish more, but that didn't help. Now, my tanks always read near 0 nitrates on ICPs, and it's never been an issue. But I decided to start dosing nitrates because that's what people do nowadays, right? It worked a little bit. Some of the corals that were lighting up darkened back up, but for others it did nothing. The main problem wasn't fixed. Growth didn't resume, and it also came with some problems. Some corals got too dark or too green, like in the case of my Walt Disney. So after months of nitrate dosing, it was clear that it wasn't the solution. Dr. Alfred Redfield is most known for the Redfield ratio. You've seen it, 16:1, which is what Redfield discovered is the atomic ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus in phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are at the base of the food web and are therefore key players in the global carbon cycle. In our hobby, many have tried to find a correlation with this ratio in regard to the best coral health, but there is far from a consensus. We're not even close to agreeing. But there's actually a bigger problem with our discussion. Nobody talks about carbon. We can debate the other two ad nauseum, but we ignore carbon. Anyway, with this in mind, about a year ago, I started dosing vodka. And let me tell you, there is no doubt in my mind that carbon dosing restored my corals to their earlier form. Growth resumed in stalled out colonies, and even corals that never budged started to grow. Colors have also returned to normal. The theory is that carbon sources that we dose in our reef tanks, such as acidic acid, ethanol, or sugar, end up being used by heterotrophic bacteria and will eventually be used up by higher organisms, similar to how phytoplankton is at the base of the food web. My theory of what happened in my tanks is eventually carbon became deficient and the most basic forms of life were unable to grow, and that eventually affected the corals. Here is a basic balanced biochemical equation for the formation of phytoplankton. Obviously, life is more complicated than a biochemical equation, but we could still learn some important concepts from it. If we say that all other factors are ideal, and we just consider the chemistry, if you are deficient in this, which is carbon, even if you have enough of these two, this equilibrium will favor the left side of the equation, which means a limitation of growth, reproduction, and even breakdown of the most basic organisms. Phytoplankton in the wild and heterotrophic bacteria in our tanks. In other words, you need enough of each of these three reactants in order to have a healthy environment. With that said, experience tells us not to overload our systems with too much of these reactants, or you could get uncontrolled growth of unwanted microorganisms. Could there be another reason I saw improvement after adding carbon? One may say the corals needed the bacterial food. Well, I would then ask, why do they need the bacterial plankton now, after 5 years of doing fine without it? I don't think they necessarily developed a need for food. I think my tanks had matured to the point where there is huge demand of all three, and carbon eventually became the limiting reactant. That shortage put a strain on everything, not just free-floating bacteria, but the whole coral symbiont, meaning the fascinating interplay of zooxanthellae, bacteria, and the rest of the microorganisms living within, on, and around the coral. But how does this happen? Are we removing too much dissolved organic carbon? Are our tanks too clean? Before carbon dosing, I tried to answer that question by going months without a filter sock and reduced skimming. It didn't solve the problem. Retrospectively, it shouldn't be a surprise because, by definition, dissolved organic carbon can pass through a filter sock. And I think The reason why having a dirtier tank didn't solve the problem is because all that detritus just doesn't get broken down fast enough into dissolved organic carbon to where the simplest microorganisms can use them. Plus, it's just disgusting. So how am I dosing it? Currently, I simply add 200 milliliters of vinegar to each gallon of calcium chloride solution I make. I'm still dosing a nitrogen source for now. A very small amount of ammonium chloride also goes into the same solution. But more on that in a little bit. After I knew carbon was the answer, I went all in and bought a zeolite reactor. But it's now sitting in storage because I realized there's an easier way to do it. I 3D printed these media baskets that fit in between the baffles in my sump. The zeolites sit in here and I simply give it a shake once per day. Folks believe that the malm that comes off the zeolite is coral food. I'm not sure if this is true because I haven't noticed a difference in growth compared to plain carbon dosing. If anything, the malm may help with polyp extension. And by the way, since I still dose ammonium chloride, I cut back on my feedings just to save money. This is how much I feed to 450 gallons of aquariums daily. Here's something that a few of you may say. You're not supposed to run that much flow through the zeolite because it may aggressively lower nutrients. This is not an issue because I'm still dosing nutrients. In fact, the goal is to not have ultra low nutrients. Rather, the only goal is to have enough of the 3 building blocks so that life in my tanks can thrive. And the reason I still dose ammonium chloride is to ensure that my nutrients don't bottom out. If you're wondering, too low phosphate has never been a problem in my systems. Carbon dosing has gotten a bad rap since its peak popularity in the late 2000s and early 2010s. People associate carbon dosing with pastel colors that are on the verge of death. But I think we need to stop equating carbon dosing with ultra-low nutrients. Yes, if you are deficient in nutrients, things can go wrong. But as long as you have ample reactants, this equilibrium will stay healthy. Do I recommend everyone start carbon dosing? Probably not. If I was to start a new tank, I don't think I'd consider it until the tank is fully mature. I've had a bad experience dosing carbon in a brand new tank. And that probably was because a healthy microbiome wasn't established and the carbon was actually being used up by more robust, opportunistic microorganisms. But if your tank is established and you are having problems, I don't think carbon dosing is harmful as long as you have nutrients in the tank. And with everything else in this hobby, just make sure you go slow. My theories and interpretation of what occurred in my tank may be scientifically flawed, especially given the complexity of living things and the reef ecosystem. But whatever the explanation, there is no doubt in my mind that carbon dosing gave my corals a new lease on life. And it follows that since my tanks are old and what I first did is no longer working, we might want to consider carbon deficiency as one of the many causes of old tank syndrome. Thank you for watching.